The stagecoach from Billings arrived 40 minutes late, and every soul in Cold Fork already knew it before the wheels stopped rolling. That was the nature of a town this size. Word moved faster than horses. It jumped from the telegraph office to the feed store to the saloon in less time than it took a man to finish his coffee. And the word that gray October afternoon passed mouth to ear across every wooden porch and muddy street corner in Cold Fork, Montana, was this Everett Briggs's mail-order bride had finally arrived. And she was a big woman, not stout, not full-figured, not a woman of generous proportions the way a polite man might phrase it in a letter. Big. The stage driver had stopped at Garrison Station 2 hours east to rest the horses and change the wheel guard, and by the time he had helped her down from the coach and back up again, the outriders had spread the news ahead of him like smoke chasing dry grass across open plain. So when the coach finally rolled to a stop in front of Whitfield's general store, the crowd was already assembled. Not a welcoming crowd. The kind of crowd a town gathers when it expects to be entertained. Mabel Crane felt them before she saw them. She felt the weight of their attention through the thin walls of the coach the way you feel a cold wind before a door opens all the way. She had felt that particular kind of attention her entire life. Her whole existence had been built beneath it, shaped by it, worn smooth in some places and rubbed raw in others, by the constant grinding pressure of being looked at and found wanting. She smoothed the front of her traveling dress. Dark gray wool, practical. The hem was muddy from the stop at Garrison. A small tear near the left cuff where the door latch had caught it on the way out. She had nothing to replace it with. This was the dress she arrived in, and it would have to be enough. She had stopped pretending she could be something she was not for the comfort of strangers long before she ever set foot on a stagecoach heading west. She gathered her traveling bag. She picked up the small bundle of dried lavender she had brought from her mother's garden in Dayton, Ohio. Her one indulgence, her one piece of home. She tucked it into her coat pocket. Then she pushed open the door and stepped out into Montana. The cold hit her like a fist. October in Cold Fork was not the polite autumn she had known in Ohio. It was a hostile, personal thing, the kind of cold that found the gaps in your coat and settled into your lungs like it intended to stay through spring. She breathed it in, held it, steadied herself on the step. Then she climbed down. She heard the laughter before both feet touched the ground. It started low, the way laughter always starts when it is trying to disguise itself as something else. A cough, a murmur, and then a boy, no older than 13, standing near the post rail with 2 friends, said it loud enough for the whole street to hear. Lord Almighty, Briggs sent for a whole woman, didn't he? The laughter spread like spilled water, fast and indiscriminate, finding every crack between the boards of that cold street. Mabel stood in the mud and let it come. She had learned a long time ago that flinching only fed it, that looking away gave people permission to go further. So she stood with her traveling bag in one hand, her spine as straight as she could hold it, and she looked at the boy who had spoken, and she waited. He stopped laughing first. Good, she thought. A man stepped forward from the crowd, wide shoulders, work-scarred hands, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same stone as the mountains rising behind the town. He held his hat in both hands, and his eyes moved over her once, just once, with an expression she could not quite read. Not cruelty, not welcome either. Something careful, something that had learned to keep its own counsel. Mabel, he said. His voice was lower than she expected. Steady, like a man who chose his words the way other men chose their tools. For use, not decoration. Mr. Briggs, she said. She had practiced saying his name in the coach. She had practiced the whole conversation the way she always did when she was walking into something that frightened her. She had imagined a dozen versions of this meeting. A kind man, a cold one. A man who looked at her and immediately regretted every word of every letter they had exchanged. What she had not imagined was the way his eyes stayed on her face, not on her body, not on the mud on her hem or the tear in her cuff, on her face. You had a long ride, he said. I did. You hungry? I could eat. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, just the ghost of one. Good, he said. The cook has been nervous about impressing you since Tuesday. I would hate for his effort to go to waste. She did not know what to do with that. She nodded. He reached for her bag. She held it half a second longer than necessary. Old habit. Old lesson. Don't let people take what's yours. Then she let him take it. My horse is at the rail, he said, turning toward the hitching post. The wagon is around back with Lester. The screaming started before he finished the sentence. Not human screaming. The high, tearing sound of a horse in pure terror and fury, a sound that was less animal and more force of nature. Something that reached inside your chest and grabbed what it found there. The stock pen at the far end of the street, a reinforced enclosure of heavy timber and iron bolts that Mabel had barely registered when she stepped off the coach, exploded outward like it was built from paper. Black. That was all she saw at first. A wall of black moving faster than something that size had any right to move. Mane like smoke, eyes white-rimmed and wild. Hooves throwing frozen mud in sheets as it hit the open street at full gallop. The crowd scattered like startled birds. Men dove behind barrels, behind wagons, behind each other. Women grabbed children and pressed into doorways. The boy who had laughed at Mabel hit the ground flat on his stomach and covered his head with his arms. Everett Briggs spun and shouted something, a name or a command. But the horse was not listening. It was not capable of listening. Whatever lived inside that animal at that moment was not thought or training or any response to a human voice. It was pure, undiluted terror wearing the costume of rage. And then Mabel saw the child, a little girl, 4 years old, maybe 5. She had been standing near the water trough with a rag doll tucked under one arm. In the chaos of the crowd scattering, she had been left behind. She stood in the center of the street, absolutely frozen, staring at the horse bearing down on her with the wide, uncomprehending eyes of someone too young to understand that she was about to be killed. Mabel was not fast. She had never been fast. Her body moved the way it always had, with effort, with deliberateness, with the particular kind of momentum that required more intention than most people gave to motion. She could not sprint. She could not throw herself across the street in 2 strides the way a lighter woman might. But she was already moving. She dropped her traveling bag. Her eyes found a flour sack that had been knocked from a cart in the chaos. Heavy. 50 pounds at least, dusted white. She grabbed it by the neck and she walked. Straight down the center of that frozen mud street, toward the horse, toward the child. Mabel. Everett's voice, sharp and close, cut through the noise behind her. Get back. She did not get back. Later, she would not be able to fully explain what she did next because there was no technique to it. No training, no system learned from any book or teacher. It was something older than technique, something she had spent her entire life learning without knowing she was learning it. She put herself between the child and the horse. She planted her feet wide and solid the way she had learned to stand when she did not want to be moved. She let the flour sack fall from her hands, and she dropped her eyes. Not down in defeat, not in the shrinking way that other people had spent 32 years trying to teach her. She dropped her gaze the way her grandmother had once told her that animals understood. Soft, sideways, not a challenge and not a surrender, just present, just here, just a creature standing in the cold that meant no harm. The horse was 30 feet away when she did it. 20. 10. She heard the crowd behind her making a sound she could not name. Not screaming exactly, more like the sound of people who have all stopped breathing in the same moment. She heard Everett's boots on the frozen ground, heard him running, heard a word she could not make out, but that sounded like a prayer dressed up as a curse. She did not look up. The horse stopped. Not gradually, not slowing over distance the way a controlled animal slows. He stopped like a wall had appeared in front of him, haunches dropping, all 4 hooves gouging furrows in the mud. The wave of his stopping rolled forward and hit her like wind, like heat, like the pressure of something enormous, choosing at the last possible second not to destroy. She felt his breath on her face before she heard him, hot and ragged and trembling. She smelled him. Sweat and fear and something wilder underneath that had never been fully broken and perhaps never would be. His nose was 6 inches from her forehead. She still did not look up. "Easy," she said. Quiet, no louder than she would have spoken to a frightened child. "Easy. Nobody here is going to hurt you." The horse's breathing was enormous. It shook through the whole street like a second heartbeat. "Easy," she said again. Then she reached behind her without looking, and her hand found the little girl's shoulder, and she walked her backward 3 steps, 4, until she felt another pair of hands, a woman's hands, desperate and shaking, take the child away. Only then did Mabel step back herself. 1 step, 2, slow. The horse stood in the street and watched her go. Cold Fork was silent. Not the silence of a crowd holding its breath, which has a pressurized quality to it, a sense of things about to burst open. This was a different silence entirely. The silence of people who had expected one thing and been given something else, and had not yet found the language for what they had seen. Everett Briggs had stopped 6 feet behind her. She could feel him there without turning around. That said a man's voice somewhere in the crowd, rough and uncertain. That was either the bravest thing I have ever seen or the stupidest. A woman's voice, sharp as a slap. "Be quiet, Howard." Mabel turned. Everett was looking at her. His hat was still in his hand from when he had taken it off to greet her, and he had not put it back on. There was something in his face she did not know what to do with. It was not the look she had received from men her whole life. The assessment, the measurement, the visible arithmetic of being found insufficient. It was not pity either. She had gotten very good at recognizing pity. This was something closer to recognition. Like he had looked at her and seen something he had been wondering about for a long time. "That horse," she said before he could speak. "What is his name?" Everett blinked. "Hellfire." "Who named him that?" I did. "About a year ago, when we brought him in off the cavalry auction. He had already put 2 men in the dirt by then." "What did they do to him?" she said. "Before you got him." Something shifted in Everett's expression. "What makes you think anyone did anything to him?" "Because a horse that is mean doesn't look like that," she said. "A horse that is mean has dead eyes. That horse has terrified eyes. There is a difference." Nobody said anything. Behind her, Hellfire let out a long, shuddering breath and dropped his head. Everett put his hat back on. "Let's get you some food," he said. "We can talk about Hellfire later. I would like that." "The food or the talking?" "Both," she said. He almost smiled again. She was beginning to think that was the most she was going to get from him, and she found, to her own surprise, that she did not mind at all. The road to Briggs Ranch ran 4 miles east of Cold Fork, climbing steadily toward the Bitterroot foothills through stands of pine so thick the afternoon light barely reached the ground. Mabel sat on the wagon bench beside Everett and watched the country unfold around her and said nothing because there was too much to take in and not enough words yet for any of it. The mountains were a thing she had not been prepared for. Ohio had hills, gentle rolling things that knew their place and stayed in it. These were different. These were the kind of mountains that reminded you how small you were without any particular malice, the way a river reminds a stone that it has been there longer and will be there longer still. She watched them and felt something in her chest that was not fear and not comfort, but something that lived between the two, a kind of vast and quiet recognition. "You picked October," Everett said after a while. "Most women pick spring or early summer for a trip like this." "Most women have more options than I had," she said. He looked at her. Then he looked back at the road. "Fair enough," he said. She had been married at 19 to a man named Walter Crane, who had been kind to her for approximately 4 months, and who had spent the 8 years after that being relentlessly disappointed by her in the specific way that certain men are disappointed by women who turn out to be different from what they imagined. Not violent. She always told herself that when she thought about it. Not violent as if that were a bar worth clearing, but relentless in his corrections. Relentless in his expectations. Relentless in the particular cruelty of a man who has decided what his wife is and will never trouble himself to look again. Walter had died of a fever 2 winters past. She had grieved him the way you grieve something that has been slowly wearing you down for years, with a complicated mixture of sorrow and relief that she suspected would never fully untangle itself no matter how many years passed. She had been alone since then. Capable, she thought. That was the word in Everett's advertisement. She had read it 3 times at her kitchen table in Dayton because no man had ever put that word in a matrimonial advertisement before. Not pretty, not young. Capable. A capable woman. A woman who could work. A woman who could last a winter. "How many hands do you run?" she asked. 8, he said. 9 in summer when the drives come through. "You know I nursed my husband through 2 winters before he passed. You mentioned it in your letters. That matters out here. We lost a man last February to a fever nobody caught in time. Doctor is 20 miles away in good weather. Further than that when the passes close." She nodded. "I didn't grow up soft. I didn't figure you did." The ranch appeared as the last light left the sky. A cluster of low buildings set against the dark of the pines' firelight in the windows of the main house, smoke from the cook's chimney already promising something warm. Not a grand ranch. A working one. She could see the difference and respected it immediately. What she also noticed, set apart from the other buildings with a double row of heavy timber posts between it and the rest of the yard, was the corral. Even from the wagon in the failing light, she could hear the horse inside it moving, back and forth, back and forth. A restless, rhythmic sound that carried across the cold yard with a quality she recognized without being able to name. "He has been like that since we got him," Everett said quietly, following her gaze. "Won't settle. Can't be ridden, can barely be approached without he tries to take your head off." She watched the dark shape move inside the fence. "How long have you had him?" "Coming up on 11 months. "What did the army do to him before the auction?" Everett was quiet for a moment. "The army trained him. Then a man in Billings bought him out of the auction and decided he could finish what the army started. Spent 2 days in a round pen with a whip and a length of chain." His voice stayed level but not unaffected. "Horse came out different than he went in. Who bought him after that? I did." She looked at him. "Why?" He set the brake onto the wagon and stepped down before he answered. "Because when I looked at him, I thought there was still something worth reaching. Something they hadn't gotten to yet." He turned and offered his hand to help her down, which she took because it was offered honestly and not out of pity. "Maybe I was wrong," he said. "You weren't wrong," she said. "The something they couldn't reach, that isn't a flaw in him. That is his survival." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he picked up her bag and walked toward the house. She followed, and the night closed in around the ranch like a hand cupping a flame against the wind. Inside the cook was a small, thin man named Gus who moved around the kitchen with the careful economy of someone who expected to be criticized and had organized his whole life around minimizing the damage. He had laid out a meal that was clearly his best effort. Roasted pork, baked potatoes, cornbread with a jar of honey beside it. A pot of coffee so dark and strong it seemed to have opinions. He stood near the stove and watched Mabel sit down with an expression of barely contained anxiety. "This looks wonderful," she said. Gus blinked. "The cornbread," she said. "Is that buttermilk?" "Yes, ma'am. My mother's recipe. Goes back to Tennessee. My grandmother made it almost the same way. She broke off a piece and ate it and let out a long, genuine breath. It is good. Really good." Something happened in Gus's face, something complicated and private. Then he turned back to the stove so she could not see it. She was halfway through her meal when the door opened and the ranch hands came in. There were 7 of them that evening, and she felt the change in the room the moment they entered, a drop in temperature that had nothing to do with the cold air they carried in with them. They filed in quietly. Too quietly. The deliberate silence of men who were being careful, which she had learned over many years to distrust more than noise. They took their seats, they helped themselves to food. No introductions were offered. It was the man at the far end of the table who spoke first. Big across the shoulders, with a nose that had been broken at least once and a jaw that suggested he had been the one doing the breaking. He was eating without looking up, and when he spoke to his plate. "Heard you made quite an entrance in town." Mabel set down her fork. "I stepped off a stagecoach," she said. "That all?" He looked up. His eyes were flat and measuring. The eyes of a man who had decided something before she ever walked through the door. "Way I heard it, you stepped in front of hellfire." "I did. Fool thing to do." "Cutter!" Everett's voice came from the head of the table. Quiet. Final. The voice of a man who does not need to raise it. The man called Cutter Vane looked at Everett for a long moment. Then he looked back at his plate and went on eating without another word. The rest of supper was silent. That night, lying in the small, clean room Everett had prepared for her under a quilt made by someone who had loved the person they were making it for, Mabel stared at the ceiling and listened to the wind come down off the mountains. It arrived in waves pressing against the walls of the house like something that wanted in. From across the yard she could hear Hellfire moving in his corral, back and forth, the sound of something that did not know how to be still. She pressed her fingers against the lavender in her coat pocket hanging on the bedpost, felt the dry stems crumble slightly at the pressure. The smell of it reached her in the cold dark. She thought about the look on Everett's face in the street, the way he had not taken his eyes off her face, the way he had not taken a step backward when she walked into the path of that horse. She thought about what it meant that the first thing he had asked her was whether she was hungry. Not what she looked like. Not whether she was what he had expected, whether she was hungry. She had not had a man ask her that before. She made herself a quiet promise there in the dark. She was not going to win anything here. She was not going to conquer anything. She was going to show up every morning before the sun. She was going to stand at that fence, and she was going to be present, and she was going to wait. That was all. Just wait. She closed her eyes, and the wind pressed against the walls, and Hellfire moved in the dark, and she let herself fall toward sleep with something in her chest that was not quite hope and not quite peace, but that lived in the same neighborhood as both. She was up before the sun. She dressed in her warmest things without lighting a lamp and walked out across the frozen yard in the gray pre-dawn, with her breath making small clouds in the still air. The cold pressed in from every direction. The mountains were invisible in the dark, but she could feel them out there, solid and patient and enormous. She stopped 10 feet from Hellfire's corral and leaned against the fence post. The horse was at the far end of the enclosure. He had heard her coming. She knew because his head had come up sharp and his whole body had gone rigid, that particular bracing quality of an animal that has learned to treat every approach as a threat. But he had not charged the fence. She considered that encouraging. "I am not here to do anything," she said to the dark and the horse and the empty morning. "I just wanted to be near something that understands what it feels like." Hellfire shifted his weight. He did not come closer, but he did not retreat. She stood at the fence until the sky began to lighten the mountains, emerging first as shapes, then as forms, then as the vast and ancient things they were catching the first thin gold along their peaks, while the valley below stayed dark. Then she went inside and started the coffee. By the time the hands came in for breakfast, she had already reorganized 2 shelves in Gus's pantry, identified which root vegetables were beginning to turn, and noted that the window seal on the east wall of the kitchen was going to let in serious cold by December if someone did not address it before the first hard freeze. Gus watched all of this with the expression of a man who was not sure whether he was witnessing something wonderful or something catastrophic, but had decided for the moment to reserve judgment. She poured her coffee and sat down at the table. Cutter Vane came through the door last. He moved through the kitchen the way he always moved. She was beginning to understand like a man who had decided long ago that the space belonged to him and had never been corrected on it. He helped himself to coffee without looking at her. He sat at his end of the table. He unfolded his napkin. Then to nobody in particular he said, "Hellfire was worked up last night." One of the younger hands got too close to the fence after supper. He said it the way men say things they want a response to, while maintaining the option to claim they were not directing it at you. Flat and sideways, not looking at her. Mabel ate her oatmeal. "You hear me, Mrs. Crane? I heard you, Mr. Vane," she said. "Thank you for the update." His eyes narrowed very slightly. He had expected something else. Argument, maybe, or distress. He was not sure what to do with even, and a man like Cutter Vane, she was already learning, only knew how to operate against resistance. She had not given him any. Everett came in from outside, stamping mud from his boots, and looked between them. He had the quality of a man who had spent a long time reading the temperature of rooms full of people who did not like each other, and the temperature in this kitchen registered on him immediately. He sat down without saying anything about it. "Cutter," he said, "I need you on the south fence line today. There is a section the snow took down last night. I was planning to work Hellfire this morning." The table went quiet. Mabel did not look up from her oatmeal. Everett's voice stayed level. "The fence comes first." A pause. The kind of pause that has weight in it. "Yes, sir," Cutter said. Flat. Final. He pushed back from his chair. He passed behind Mabel's seat on the way out. He did not say anything. He did not have to. She could feel the intention in it, the way you feel a cold draft from a window that is not quite closed, not a blow, a reminder that something outside was much colder than in here, and it was patient and it was waiting. Everett watched the door close, then he looked at her. "Is there something I should know about?" he said. "No," she said. He studied her for a long moment with the expression of a man who is fairly certain he is being told a partial truth and has decided for now to honor it. "All right," he said, and he reached for the bread. On the 7th morning, she found the whip. She had been at the fence for her usual hour, talking quietly about nothing in particular, watching Hellfire watch her from the far end of the corral when she saw it. Tucked behind the far corner post, a short-handled driving whip, the kind used in round pen work. It had not been there the morning before. She was certain of it. She looked at the whip for a long moment, then she looked at Hellfire. The horse was pressed into the far corner of the enclosure, his breathing labored, his eyes white-rimmed in a way that had nothing to do with her presence. Someone had used this whip on him. Recently. Last night, she thought, or in the early hours before she arrived. The anger that moved through her was cold and quiet and complete. She had felt this kind of anger before. The specific purifying fury of watching something that cannot defend itself be hurt by something that should have known better. She had felt it in small ways across her entire life. In rooms and offices and doorways where she had been made to feel that her presence was an imposition. In the long years of a marriage where the weapons were never raised, hands but always, and only words. And the target was always her particular way of existing in the world. She picked up the whip. She carried it across the yard. She walked into the kitchen where Gus was already at the stove starting the breakfast fire, and she opened the iron door, and she fed the whip into it piece by piece without a word. Gus stood with his back to her and stirred the oats. When she was finished, she poured herself a cup of the warming coffee and sat down. "You didn't see that she told him?" Gus kept his eyes on the stove. "See what, ma'am?" She drank her coffee. At breakfast, Cutter said Hellfire was worked up last night. One of the boys said they heard a commotion around midnight. Mabel ate her oatmeal. "You hear me, Mrs. Crane. I heard you, Mr. Vane. Thank you for the update." Exactly as before. Not a single word different. She gave him the same response and watched him receive it and find again that there was nothing in it to push against. That afternoon she went back to the corral, the first time outside her morning routine. Hellfire heard her coming and went still in the way she was beginning to distinguish as different from how he went still for the hands. Not bracing, just still. Head up, ears forward, watching. She stopped at the fence and held her hands open at her sides the way she always did. "I know," she said quietly. "I know last night was bad. I am sorry I was not here." The horse breathed. His sides rose and fell. "It is not going to happen again," she said. "I cannot promise you everything, Hellfire, but I can promise you that." She stayed until the light started to fail. When she went back inside, Lester was near the barn door. He was 17 and gap-toothed and had the charming quality of being constitutionally unable to keep a thought inside his head for more than about 30 seconds. He fell into step beside her as she crossed the yard. "Mrs. Crane," he said. She looked at him. He was quiet for a moment, which was unusual. Then he said, "Cutter has been telling the hands that what you are doing with that horse is going to make him more dangerous, that coddling a dangerous animal makes it worse. What do the other hands say?" "Most of them agree with Cutter." He paused. "It is easier to agree with Cutter." "I imagine it is, but I was up early this morning," he said. "I saw you at the fence. And while you were standing there, Hellfire moved from the back corner up to the middle of the corral." He shook his head slowly. "He has never done that for anyone, not since I have been here." She said nothing. "I just thought you should know," he said, "that not everyone thinks you are well." He stopped. "Some of us are paying attention is what I mean to say." She looked at him. He looked back earnest and young, and a little embarrassed by his own honesty, which he found entirely genuine, and therefore worth more than polished certainty. "Thank you, Lester," she said. He nodded and headed back toward the barn. She watched him go and thought about what it meant to have an ally you had not asked for, the particular unexpected warmth of being seen by someone who did not have to look. That evening, after the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Gus had cleaned the kitchen and gone to his quarters, Mabel sat at the table with the pantry inventory she had started and wrote down everything she had observed in her first full week at Briggs Ranch. The root cellar, the window seal, the way Gus tensed every time a boot scraped the floor, the way Lester watched her at breakfast with the open attention of someone who had not yet decided what he thought, the way Hellfire had not charged the fence when she approached in the dark. Small things. But she had learned a long time ago that small things were the only true measure of anything, that the large and dramatic gestures people made were usually performances, that what a person or an animal actually was you found in the small things, in whether they flinched or stood still, in what they did when they thought no one was watching. She pressed her fingers against the lavender in her pocket, heard the wind, heard faintly the sound of Hellfire moving in the corral. Still restless, but she thought a little less than yesterday. She closed her notebook and went to bed. On the 9th morning she found a second whip. Same post, same position, as deliberate as a signature. Hellfire was in the far corner again, head low, sides heaving. The marks on his flank were fresher than the last time. She stood very still. She thought about the breakfast table, about Cutter's flat sideways voice, and the way he watched her from the corner of his eye while pretending to look at his plate. She thought about walking into the bunkhouse right now and saying what needed to be said in front of every man on the ranch. Then she looked at Hellfire, and she thought about what it would cost him to become the center of an open war before she had enough ground under her to win it. She did not go to the bunkhouse. She carried the second whip out to the far edge of the yard, to the frost-hardened ground near the tree line where the shadows still held from the night. She found a stone and used it to break through the frozen crust, and she dug with her hands until the hole was deep enough, and she put the whip in it and covered it over and pressed the frozen earth back down flat. She did not tell anyone. She did not mention it at breakfast. She did not look at Cutter when he came in and poured his coffee and settled into his chair. But after breakfast, when the other hands had gone out and Everett was reviewing the supply ledger in the front room, Cutter stepped into the kitchen doorway and spoke directly to her for the first time without the pretense of addressing the room. "Mrs. Crane, I want you to stop going to that corral." She was standing at the counter going through the root cellar inventory. She did not turn around immediately. She finished the line she was writing, set down her pencil, and then she turned. "That is not your decision to make, Mr. Vane," she said. "It is when it puts hands at risk. That animal is not a project. He is a liability." She looked at him. He was filling the doorway with the particular mass of a man who has learned to use physical space as argument. She had been standing up to that argument her whole life. "Then let Everett make that decision," she said. "Not you." A long silence. His jaw tightened. "I am telling you as the man who runs this operation day to day," he said. "I am telling you it is not safe." "I understand what you are telling me," she said. "And I am telling you what I have already told you. That is not your decision to make." She turned back to the inventory. He stood in the doorway for another moment. Then she heard him leave and the kitchen was quiet again, and she kept writing, though her hand was not entirely steady, and she did not let herself acknowledge that for several minutes. That afternoon, Everett found her at the corral. He came up beside her and looked at Hellfire, and for a while neither of them said anything. Then he said, "Cutter came to me this morning." "I know," she said. "He told me you are spending too much time at this corral and that it is disrupting the hands." She kept her eyes on the horse. "What did you tell him?" Everett was quiet for a moment. "I told him that who my wife spends her time with is not his concern." He paused, and then I asked him if there was anything else on his mind. She looked at him. "Was there?" He said there wasn't, but the way he said it told a different story. He turned his hat over in his hands. "Mabel, is there something happening here I should know about?" She considered it. The full and honest answer was that Cutter Vane had been going into Hellfire's corral at night with a whip and setting back everything she was building, and that she had found and destroyed the evidence twice and said nothing because she was not ready to fight that war yet. The full and honest answer was that she was handling it and that she did not want Everett to handle it for her, because if he did, it would become his fight and not hers, and she needed it to be hers. "Not yet," she said. "But I want you to know that when there is, I will tell you." He looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded once. "All right," he said. "That is fair." She looked back at Hellfire. The horse was watching them both from the center of the corral. Not braced, not pacing, just watching with his ears forward and his dark eyes moving between them, reading something in the space between two people that only animals and very attentive humans ever learn to see. "He is watching us," Everett said. "He is always watching," she said. "That is what people miss about him. They see the fury and they stop looking, but underneath it, he is the most attentive creature on this property." Everett was quiet for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I think that might be true of more than the horse." She did not answer. But she heard it, and she held it, and she carried it with her back across the frozen yard and into the house where Gus was making cornbread again, and the kitchen smelled of buttermilk and wood smoke and the particular warmth of a place that was beginning slowly to feel like somewhere she had the right to be. The 11th morning changed something. Mabel had been at the fence for 40 minutes. The cold had settled into her boots, and her fingers had gone stiff around the coffee mug she had carried out from the kitchen. She was talking about her mother's garden in Dayton, the way the sweet peas came up every June along the south fence without anyone planting them, the way her mother said they came back because they knew they were wanted there. She was not talking to be heard. She was talking because silence felt different to a frightened animal than sound did. Silence was the unknown. Sound was a presence. And a presence that meant no harm was the first thing you gave to something that had forgotten what that felt like. Hellfire stood at the center of the corral, not the far end. The center. He had been moving closer in increments so small that a person not paying attention would have missed them entirely. 3 feet closer on the 5th morning, another 2 on the 7th. By the 9th day, he had been standing roughly at the midpoint of the enclosure when she arrived, which was different from where he had been on the first morning when he had pressed himself into the far corner, as if trying to push through the timber and disappear into the mountain behind it. She was talking about the sweet peas when he moved. Not a test, not a circle. A direct, deliberate walk toward the fence, unhurried the way an animal moves when it has made a decision and is following through on it. She felt her breath change, but she did not change anything else. Her hands stayed open at her sides. Her eyes stayed soft and angled down. He stopped at the rail. His nose hung over the top board, and then it came down and touched the back of her left hand. 3 seconds. She closed her eyes. The warmth of it, the rough, dry heat of a horse's muzzle against her skin in the freezing air, was the most real thing she had felt in a very long time. She stood completely still and let it happen, and did not reach for him because she had learned that reaching was always the wrong response to something fragile coming toward you. You did not reach. You received. He pulled back, turned, walked to the center of the corral and stood there with his back to her, the way horses do when they are finished with something but have not fully decided what to do next. She opened her eyes. She looked at the place on her hand, where his breath had left a faint warmth, already fading in the cold. She did not celebrate. She picked up her coffee mug and walked back to the house and sat at the kitchen table and drank what was left, which was cold by then. And she felt something moving through her chest that had no precise name but that she recognized. She had felt it once before, years ago, the morning after Walter's funeral, when she had stood in the doorway of her own kitchen and realized for the first time in a very long time that the day ahead belonged entirely to her. Not joy, exactly. Something quieter, the specific sensation of a door that has been closed for a long time, opening just enough to let in light. That evening at supper, Lester could not contain himself. "I saw it," he said, before the bread had even been passed. "This morning at the fence." He looked around the table with the barely suppressed energy of someone carrying news he has been holding all day. Hellfire came to her. He touched her hand. The table was quiet. Wick spoke without looking up from his plate. He was one of the older hands, lean and sun-darkened, a man of about 50 who had not said a direct word to Mabel in 11 days. "That horse put a man through the fence in August," he said. "Owen still cannot close his left hand all the way." "He touched her," Lester said simply. Nobody argued with that. Mabel ate her dinner and said nothing. The best thing you could do when the truth was working for you was to stay out of its way. Cutter's chair was empty. She did not ask about it. She told Everett that evening, not with drama, not with triumph. She set down her pen and said, "He touched my hand this morning through the rail." Everett set down his pencil. "I did not reach for him," she said. "He came to me." For a moment, he looked at her with something working its way past disbelief. Then he said slowly, "How long have you been going out there every morning?" 11 days. He picked up his pencil, set it down again. "Hellfire has put 3 men in the dirt in the last 4 months. One of them still cannot close his hand. And he came to you. He came to me." Everett looked out the window at the dark yard. "Cutter is going to say you imagined it. Cutter is welcome to stand at that fence himself tomorrow morning and see what the horse does for him." Something shifted in Everett's expression. The things she had noticed before, that quality of recognition, deepening into something else. "You would let him try?" "I am not in the business of keeping things secret," she said. "The progress belongs to the horse. Anyone who wants to observe it is welcome to." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mrs. Crane, can I ask you something personal?" She folded her hands on the table. "You can try, your husband. The letters you mentioned. You said he treated you badly." "I said he humiliated me," she said. "That is more specific." He accepted the correction. "Did he know what you were capable of?" "Before?" "No," she said. "He decided what I was capable of the week after we married, and he never looked again." Everett turned his pencil over in his fingers. "My wife," he said, and stopped. Started again. "Eleanor understood people the way other people understand weather. She could walk into a room and tell you within 5 minutes who was lying, and who was afraid, and who was carrying something they had not told anyone." He paused. "I have not had anyone here since she passed who could read a room like that." He set the pencil down. "Until now," he said. She sat with that for a moment. 3 words. She thought about how many years she had gone without anything like them, and how much space they occupied, now that someone had said them. "Thank you," she said. And then, because honesty was the only currency she had ever fully trusted, "I do not know yet what this is between us. I think we are both too careful to be hasty about naming it. But I think you are a fair man, and I have not had one of those before, so I am not entirely sure what to do with it yet." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I reckon we have time to figure that out." She went to bed that night thinking about fairness. What it cost, what it meant. How rarely it announced itself and how clearly you felt it when it was real. The second whip had been buried. The third confrontation was still coming. It arrived not at breakfast, not through the sideways language of a man speaking to his plate, but directly. 3 days after Hellfire had touched her hand, Mabel was in the root cellar working through the winter inventory when she heard Cutter's footsteps on the stairs. Not Gus's careful shuffle, not Lester's quick, uneven gait. The deliberate, weighted step of a man who has decided to say something and has come to where the person is, rather than waiting for the public theater of the breakfast table. She kept working. He stood at the bottom of the stairs for a moment. Then he said, "You burned the first whip." She continued counting the turnips. "I burned a whip I found at the corral," she said. "I do not know whose it was." "You know whose it was." She set down her tally and turned to face him. The root cellar was low-ceilinged and lit by a single lamp, and Cutter Vane was too large for it, which she suspected was not an accident. She held her ground in 3 feet of space between a shelf of preserved beets and a man who wanted her gone. "Tell me something, Mr. Vane," she said. "How many times did you go into that corral with a whip?" The muscle in his jaw tightened. "Enough times to know what that animal is. How many times did you walk out without him taking a piece of you?" The silence stretched long enough to be an answer. "He chose not to kill you," she said. "Not because you controlled him, because he chose. That choice you keep trying to take away from him is the only thing keeping this ranch safe. You destroy that you do not have a dangerous horse anymore. You have a dead one, or a dead man." He looked at her with the flat eyes she had seen across the breakfast table for 2 weeks. But there was something different in them now. Not defeat. Something that was working toward honesty the way cold ground works toward thaw. Slow and resistant and real. "You do not know what you are talking about," he said. "Maybe not," she said. "But he touched my hand 11 days ago, and he has never touched yours. So one of us is doing something right, and one of us has been going into the dark." She held his gaze with the steadiness of someone who has nothing left to lose by being seen. "You are afraid of that horse. You have been afraid of him since the first day, and fear turned into cruelty the way it always does when a man will not admit to being afraid." Something moved across Cutter's face. Something she would not have been able to name a week ago, but that she recognized now. It was the same thing she had seen in Hellfire's eyes on the 3rd morning. The moment when a creature that has been performing ferocity realizes that the person looking at it can see straight through the performance to what is underneath. "If I tell Everett what you have done," she said, "you lose this position, and you have nothing else. That does not help the horse. It does not help you. And I did not come all the way to Montana to make things worse." The lamp flickered. Cutter Vane stood in the root cellar of a ranch he had run for 4 years and looked at a woman he had tried to drive away since she stepped off the stagecoach, and he could not find the shape for what she had said that he could be angry at. "You do not know anything about me," he said finally. "I know you are good at your job," she said. "I have watched you for 2 weeks. You know this ranch and you care about it. A man who cares about a place does not go around hurting things just to hurt them. You were trying to fix something. I understand that. You just had the wrong tools." He said nothing. "What you can do for me," she said, "is stop being another thing that animal has to brace against. You do not have to come to the fence. You do not have to do anything. Just stop being the thing in the dark. If you can do that, you have done enough." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he turned and went back up the stairs without another word, and his footsteps crossed the kitchen floor above her, and the door opened and closed, and she was alone in the root cellar with the lamp and the winter stores and the particular silence of a battle that had just changed shape without anyone winning it yet. She stood there for a moment. Then she went back to counting the turnips. The 3rd week of November brought 3 days of unexpected warmth that softened the ground and gave Everett an excuse to take most of the hands out to address the fence lines before the hard freeze locked everything in place. Mabel had the ranch largely to herself. She used the time the way she used every available hour working through the household inventory, patching the east kitchen window with oilskin and tallow until the draft stopped reorganizing the supply ledger. And she went to the corral every morning and every afternoon and sometimes in the evening before supper. On the second evening of those quiet days, Hellfire walked to the fence when he heard her footsteps cross the yard. Not when she reached the post, when he heard her coming. She leaned on the rail and he pressed his nose against her shoulder through the boards, and she stood in the early dark and let the cold work through her coat and thought about what it meant that a creature which had spent 11 months bracing against everything was choosing on its own to move toward her. "I know what it is to be ready before the world decides you are," she said. "I have been ready my whole life and been told to wait." She looked at him through the rail. "We are not waiting anymore. Either of us." Hellfire breathed against her collar. She stayed until the cold made her hands stop working properly. On the 14th day the letter arrived. She knew from the handwriting before she read the name. Edmund Crane, her late husband's younger brother. She had not heard from Edmund in 8 months. Not since the day she had signed the final papers on the Dayton property and sent him his share of exactly nothing, because Walter had left no share for Edmund to claim only debts and a house that had sold for just enough to fund the ticket west with $43 remaining. This letter had been addressed to Everett, not to her. To Everett. She read this on the envelope and felt the cold, familiar weight of a man who has decided the way to manage a woman is to go around her. Edmund had always operated this way, around and over, never directly because direct required a kind of courage he had never possessed. Everett brought the letter to her after supper without comment. He set it on the table and sat across from her and watched her read. Edmund's position, laid out in the careful language of a man who had spent time with a lawyer before writing, was that the sale of the Dayton property had been conducted improperly. That as the surviving male relative of Walter Crane, he had claims on the estate that had not been honored. That the marriage of Mabel Crane to Everett Briggs, conducted with unseemly haste, might not be legally binding, given the outstanding questions. He was threatening to contest the marriage in territorial court. Mabel read it twice. Then she set it down. "What do you want to do?" Everett said. She looked at him. "What do you want to do?" He did not hesitate. "I want to send my attorney in Billings a letter tonight and have Edmund Crane understand by the end of the month that this marriage is valid. The property sale was legal, and that if he wants to continue pressing the matter, he is welcome to make the trip out here and say so to my face." "That might not be enough," she said. "Edmund does not stop when he is told to stop. He stops when it costs him something. Then we make it cost him something." She felt the particular solidity of a man who meant what he said and said only what he meant. It was a different sensation from what she was accustomed to. "I will write him myself," she said. "Mabel, I will write him myself." She said it not to override him, but to be clear. "He is my problem for my life, and I will handle him. But I would be grateful if your attorney sent a letter at the same time so Edmund understands this is not just me speaking." Everett looked at her for a long moment. "That is reasonable," he said. She wrote the letter that night. 3 paragraphs. Not cruel and not soft, leaving Edmund no interpretive room whatsoever. She told him what the Dayton property had sold for. She told him what Walter's debts had amounted to. She directed any further correspondence to Everett's attorney in Billings. She told him she wished him well and had no interest in his presence in her life. She sealed it, set it beside Everett's attorney letter on the hall table, and went to bed and slept better than she had in 2 weeks. The 19th morning. She told Everett the night before. Not asking, just telling him because she had decided early in this arrangement, if it was going to become a real marriage, that she would not do significant things behind his back, even when she was going to do them, regardless of his response. "Is he ready?" Everett said. "I think so. I think he's been ready for 3 days, and I have been the one who needed more time. That is honest. I try to be." He looked at her across the table with the expression that had weather in it. "You want company out there?" "No. If something goes wrong, I want one less person for him to be frightened of. And if something goes very wrong, you will hear it and you can come running." He did not laugh, but the line of his shoulders changed in a way that meant something. "All right," he said. "I won't watch." "Thank you," she said. She went to the corral in the gray pre-dawn and did her usual routine first. The fence post, the open hands, the talking. She needed him to know that this morning was still her morning, still the same as every morning before it became something else. Then she unlatched the gate. Hellfire heard it. His whole body changed. She watched the tension move through him from his head to his flank, watched his weight shift back, watched his nostrils work. She came through the gate and latched it behind her. She did not walk toward him. She stood just inside the fence, looked at the ground soft and sideways, and waited. 30 seconds. A minute. The horse made a sound. Not a warning, not the scream she had heard the day he broke from the pen in Cold Fork. Something lower, rougher, more uncertain, like a question asked by something that is not sure it deserves an answer. "I am here," she said, barely above a whisper. "Take your time." 2 minutes. 5. She heard him move, not toward her at first. He moved in a long, lateral arc, keeping his distance, testing the perimeter of the space they now shared. She tracked him with her peripheral vision and stayed perfectly still. He was enormous up close in the same enclosure as her, larger than he had looked from outside the fence. She felt the reality of him in her chest, the very real possibility of everything that could go wrong. She breathed through it. He made another arc, smaller, spiraling inward the way water finds the lowest point, not quickly, not directly, but with a kind of quiet inevitability that she recognized as something she had felt herself, the long, slow movement of a frightened thing deciding to try. When his nose reached her shoulder, she had been standing in the cold for 11 minutes. She let him investigate her. Her coat, her hair, the side of her face. She let him take what time he needed because this was his decision to make, and she had stopped making decisions for creatures that deserved the dignity of making their own. Then she raised her hand, slowly. The way you raise your hand in a room where something fragile is balanced on an edge. She laid her palm flat against his neck. He flinched. The flinch moved through his whole body like a current through wire. She did not pull back. She kept her hand there, steady and warm. "You are all right," she said. "Nobody is going to take this from you." The flinch subsided, and then slowly, the way trust always comes. Not in a rush, but in a long exhale, he lowered his head against her hand. She felt his whole body settle. She closed her eyes and stayed exactly where she was. When she came out of the corral, 20 minutes later, Everett was standing at the kitchen door with 2 mugs of coffee. He held one out. She took it with both hands. "He let me touch him," she said. Everett looked at the corral for a long time. Then he said, "In 20 years of working with horses, I have never seen anything like what you have done with that animal." She drank her coffee. "I mean that," he said. "I know you do. That is why I like hearing you say it." He looked at her with the expression that had weather in it, and she looked back. And neither of them said what was in the air between them because they were both careful people, and there was no need to rush what was already clearly on its way. The second letter from Edmund arrived 10 days later. This one came directly to her. Edmund had set aside his legal language and replaced it with something older and more personal. He wrote about Walter, about what Walter had said about her in private in letters to Edmund over the years of their marriage. About her size and her manner and her habit of having opinions and the way she made a man feel insufficient without ever seeming to try. He wrote that Walter had told him near the end that he had spent 11 years married to a woman who made him feel small every single day just by being herself and expecting the world to accommodate it. He wrote, "He was ashamed of you. I am only saying what he could never bring himself to say to your face." She read it at the kitchen table at 9:30 at night, with the lamp burning low and the wind pressing against the east wall and the house quiet around her. She read it twice. She set it down. She sat. She did not know how long she sat there before she heard the creak of floorboards near the pantry door. Gus appeared in his nightclothes, blinking in the lamplight, the confused expression of a man woken by a sound he could not identify. He looked at her. He looked at the letter on the table. He did not say anything. He went to the stove. He put the kettle on. He waited for it to heat, and when it was ready, he poured 2 cups and set one beside her without a word, and sat at the far end of the table with his own. They sat in the kitchen with the wind against the walls and the lamp burning down. After a while, Gus said very quietly, not looking at her, "My father told me once that a man who speaks badly of his wife to other people is always telling you more about himself than he is telling you about her." She looked at him. He was looking at his cup. "I thought you should know," he said, "that I have been cooking for working men my whole adult life. And in all that time, the only person who has ever told me my cornbread was really good and actually meant it was you." She looked at him for a moment. "Thank you, Gus," she said. He nodded, drank his coffee, got up, rinsed his cup, and went back to his quarters without another word. She sat a while longer. Then she folded Edmund's letter, took it to the stove, opened the iron door, and held it over the coals until it caught. She watched it burn down to ash. Then she closed the door and went to bed. In the morning, she went to the corral. Hellfire was waiting at the near fence line. He had heard her footsteps in the yard before she reached him. She leaned on the post, and he pressed his nose against her shoulder through the rail, and she stood in the early dark and let the cold work through her coat and thought about what Gus's father had said, and thought about what Walter had said in those letters, and thought about the 11 years she had spent being the weight of a man's disappointment without fully understanding that the disappointment was never about her. It never had been. She stayed at the fence until the sky turned gray at the edges. Then she went inside and made the coffee and started her day. Cutter Vane found her inside the corral on the afternoon of the 21st day. She was working with Hellfire, not training, not demanding, just sharing space with him while he moved around the enclosure on his own terms. When she heard Cutter's boots on the frozen ground and turned to see him at the rail, something in his posture was different from every other time he had approached her. The flatness in his eyes was still there, but it was covering something now. Something she recognized because she had seen its cousin in the mirror on the worst mornings of her own life. He said, "I owe you an explanation." She waited. He put his hands on the top rail and looked at Hellfire, who was watching him with the focused attention of an animal cataloging a threat, nostrils wide, weight shifted back, ears forward. "I tried to break that horse 8 months before you came here," Cutter said. "Round pen, 2 days, everything I knew." He looked at his hands on the rail. He did not break. But I did a little. Something in me did. He shook his head. "I have been doing this work my whole life, and I have never met an animal I could not bring around. And then that horse looked at me the way he looked at me, like I was nothing, like I was something to be endured, until I went away." He stopped. She waited. "And then you came here," he said. "And you stood at that fence every morning, doing nothing, just standing there talking, and inside 2 weeks he was at the near rail. His jaw worked. I could not let that be what it was. I could not let it mean what it meant." She looked at him with the same directness she had turned on everything here, the root cellar, the ledger, the frightened horse, the man who had tried to drive her away. "You were trying to fix something," she said. "I understand that. You just had the wrong tools." He looked at Hellfire. The horse had not moved from his watchful position. "He will never trust me," Cutter said. The anger was entirely gone from his voice. What was underneath was older and rawer and more honest. "No," she said. "Probably not. Not after what happened." She let that settle. "But that is not the same as useless. There is more to this ranch than one horse." He was quiet for a long time. Then, "What do you need from me?" She looked at him carefully. He had asked it plainly, without performance or strategy, and she understood what it cost a man like Cutter Vane to ask anyone for direction. "Stop being the thing in the dark," she said. "You do not have to do anything positive. Just stop being another thing he has to brace against. If you can do that, you have done enough." He nodded once. Firm. Decisive. The nod of a man who has made an accounting and accepted the result. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back toward the bunkhouse. She stood at the fence in the evening cold and waited for her hands to stop shaking. They had been shaking since he had walked up to the rail, though she had not let him see it. She breathed out a long, slow exhale that made a cloud in the cold air, and then was gone. Hellfire pushed his nose over the rail and bumped her shoulder. She startled. He startled. They stood there a full second, both surprised by the other. Then she pressed her palm gently against the side of his face, and he let her, and she stood in the cold Montana evening with her hand against the face of the most difficult horse in the territory, and thought this is part of what you came for, and you did not know it until now. From the shadow of the barn doorway, 30 feet distant, Lester stood and watched, and did not move for a long time. She did not know he was there. She did not know that by morning every hand on Briggs' ranch would know what he had seen. Not the confrontations, and not the burned whip, and not the buried one, but the small specific miracle of Hellfire bumping her shoulder in the cold, and her palm resting against his face as if it had always belonged there. And she did not know that Cutter Vane stood for a long time in the bunkhouse doorway, looking at the corral in the dark, and that the expression on his face was not anger and not contempt, but something he had not worn in a very long time. It looked from a distance like a man who had just understood something he had been refusing to understand, and who was not entirely sure yet what to do with the understanding, but who had stopped refusing it. And that she would come to know was its own kind of beginning. She felt the storm coming 2 days before it arrived, not from any single sign, but from the accumulation of small ones that a person learns to read only after spending enough time paying attention to things other people dismiss. The way the cattle had been bunching along the lower fence line since Tuesday morning, pressing together with a collective animal certainty that something large and cold was moving their way. The way Hellfire had been pacing the north side of his corral since Monday evening, not the restless pacing of an unsettled animal, but something more directional, like a compass needle swinging toward a pole it could not name. The quality of the light on Wednesday afternoon, which had a particular flat, colorless character that Mabel had seen once before. The winter before Walter died, when the worst storm in a decade had come down out of Canada and buried Dayton under 3 feet of snow before morning. She mentioned it at supper on Wednesday evening. "There is a big storm coming," she said. 2 days, maybe less. Cutter looked up from his plate. "Sky has been clear all week. The cattle are bunching along the lower line," she said, "and Hellfire has been pacing the north fence since Monday. He did not do that before the last cold snap either. That one took down a section of the south line." The hands exchanged looks, not dismissive. They were past dismissive with her by now, but uncertain in the way of men who have their own systems for reading weather and are not sure what to do with a system that is different from theirs and keeps being right. Everett looked at Wick, who was the oldest hand on the ranch and had wintered in Montana longer than anyone else at the table. Wick held his coffee mug in both hands and looked at the surface of it for a moment. "Got a smell to it," he said finally. "Could be she is right." Everett set down his fork. "We move the cattle to the lower pasture tomorrow morning," he said. "Get the extra feed into the barn before noon. I want the horses checked and the south gate reinforced before dark." Nobody argued. But the storm did not wait for tomorrow morning. It came that night. Mabel woke at 2 o'clock to the sound of it, which was not exactly a sound, but a pressure, a deep, concussive force against the walls of the house that she felt in her chest before she heard it with her ears. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since supper. She lay in the dark for 30 seconds, listening to the wind build. Then she got up. She was dressed and in the kitchen before the first boots sounded in the hallway. Everett came in from outside, already in his coat, moving with the compressed efficiency of a man operating in an emergency. The cattle had spooked north in the night. Up the ridge. Cutter was getting the horses ready. They needed to go after them before the trail froze completely, or they would lose animals to the cold before morning. "You stay here," Everett said. She looked at him. "I need someone here who can manage the ranch if we are out longer than planned," he said. He said it directly without apology or condescension. "Someone who knows where everything is. Someone Gus will not panic with. I need you here, Mabel. Can you do that?" She understood what he was asking and why. She hated it the way you hate necessary things, with a clean, undramatic recognition that the feeling did not change the logic. "Yes," she said. He put his hand against her face, brief and warm and deliberate. Then he went out into the storm, and the dark closed behind him, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched the lanterns move across the yard and disappear into the white. She told herself it was fine at 6 in the morning. She told herself the same at 8 and at 10 and at noon, when the storm had not broken and the hands had not returned and the world outside the windows had become a single, undifferentiated wall of white and wind that made it impossible to see the barn from the kitchen door. Gus made soup. He moved around the kitchen with a focused, deliberate quiet that told her he was frightened and had decided that usefulness was the best available response to it. She organized the medical supplies she had inventoried in her first week and laid out what she thought she might need. Lester fed the remaining horses and came back with ice in his hair and reported that Hellfire was calm, which she received as information without explaining to Lester why it mattered to her. At 2 in the afternoon, she heard hooves in the yard. She was at the door before the rider had fully stopped. It was Lester coming in from the bunkhouse direction, and beside him was a rider she did not immediately recognize through the snow. Then the rider pushed back his collar, and she saw it was young Tommy from the North Crew, and he was moving with the careful, measured gait of someone operating entirely on determination. She had them both inside within 30 seconds. The ridge trail had given out, Lester said. Ice under the snow. Tommy's horse had gone down on it. Tommy was alive, a twisted ankle and a bad fright, but then the wind had come in sideways and visibility had dropped to nothing, and they had lost the trail entirely. Most of the hands had found their way to Patton's line shack a mile east of the ridge, but Everett had not made it to the shack. His horse had spooked at something in the whiteout and thrown him. Cutter had seen it happen. Everett was in a gully halfway up the ridge under a rock overhang that was keeping the worst of the snow off him, and Cutter had stayed with him. But the gully was iced over on 3 sides, and Everett could not walk, and the horses at the line shack would not take the iced trail to the gully. He had been there since roughly 10 in the morning. It was now past 2 in the afternoon. "What do you need?" Mabel said. "Someone to get to the Marsh Ranch," Lester said. "Their eastern trail runs lower, misses the worst of the ice. Their horses know that approach, but the road to Marsh runs past the ridge base and in this weather." He stopped. "No horse we have here will take it, Mrs. Crane." "Not in this." She was already standing up. Lester looked at her. "Mrs. Crane." "Stay here," she said. "Get warm. Tell Gus to keep you warm." She crossed the kitchen, took her coat from the hook, wrapped her scarf twice around her face, and went out the back door. The cold on the far side of the door was a different category of experience from cold she had known before. It had weight and direction and a kind of intention. It pressed in from every side simultaneously and found every gap and went into those gaps and stayed. She put her head down and walked. The barn was 30 feet from the house. In the storm, it took longer than it should have to find it. She went by feel as much as sight, one hand extended until her fingers found the barn door, and she got it open and got herself inside. The barn was dark and warm by comparison, and the horses in their stalls shifted at her entrance. She walked past them to the far end where Hellfire's separate enclosure stood inside the barn structure, a reinforced space Everett had built when the weather grew too dangerous to leave him in the outdoor corral alone. Hellfire heard her before she reached him. She knew because he was already at the rail when she got there, not pacing, not braced, just standing with his head up and his ears forward and his breath making steady clouds in the cold air, waiting, watching the door. The way he had been waiting every morning for 3 weeks when he heard her footsteps cross the yard. She unlatched the gate and went in. He came to her directly. No arc, no testing of the perimeter, just straight across the space to her, and she put both hands on his face and looked at him in the dim barn light. She had been thinking on the walk across the yard about what she needed to say, about whether there were words for it, about whether what she was about to ask could be asked at all, or whether asking was even the right frame for it, whether it was more like an invitation than a request, more like opening a door than walking through one. "I know what it is," she said, "to carry more than people think a body can bear. You know it too. We have both been carrying it our whole lives, and we are still here." She pressed her forehead gently against his nose, felt the warmth of him in the cold. "I need to ask you something," she said, "and I need you to know that you can say no. I will not put a rope on you and drag you out into this. I am asking. Just asking." She pulled back and looked at him. "I need you to carry me through that storm, just tonight. And I promise you the same as I have promised you every morning for 3 weeks. You can choose. I am not taking anything from you. I am asking." The wind hit the barn wall. The whole structure shuddered. The lamp overhead swayed. Hellfire stood absolutely still. She could hear her own heartbeat. She could hear the storm pressing against the boards above them. She could hear everything except what she was waiting for, which was not a sound but a decision, the particular silence of a creature at the exact moment it chooses. He lowered himself. Not all the way, not the full kneel of a cavalry horse answering a command. Just enough. A lowering of his front end, a shift of his weight, an offering that said, "I heard you. I choose this." Her throat closed completely. She mounted. She did not give herself time to think. She had learned that thinking was the enemy of things that needed to be done on faith. She put her weight where his lowered shoulder gave her purchase, and she rose and she settled across his back and she felt him hold it. Feel it. Decide to keep holding it. "Thank you," she said. So quietly, it was nearly not words at all. She rode out into the storm. The cold on horseback in a blizzard was a different creature from any cold she had known. It came at her from every direction at once, and the wind at the ridge base curve hit them broadside with a force that had geography behind it, something geological and ancient and entirely indifferent to the saw-warm thing on the back of a black horse trying to cross its path. For 30 full seconds on that curve, she could not see anything at all. She bent low and pressed her face against Hellfire's neck. "You know where the ground is," she said. "I trust you." She felt him lean into the wind. She felt the decision in his muscles, the shift from uncertainty to commitment. The same shift she had felt in herself 100 times, the moment when fear stops being a reason to stop and becomes simply a condition to move through. He kept going. The marsh ranch appeared through the white as a cluster of warm lights strung in the dark. And those lights were the most beautiful thing Mabel Crane had seen since Ohio. She came off Hellfire before he had fully stopped and got herself across the porch and knocked. Dorothea Marsh opened the door. Dorothea was 60 years old and had been wintering in Montana since before Cold Fork had a name. She had the particular quality of a woman who has seen enough emergencies to have stopped being surprised by them and started simply being useful. She looked at Mabel, covered in snow, half her face white with cold, standing on her porch in a blizzard, and she did not ask a single unnecessary question. "Everett is on the North Ridge," Mabel said. "East Gully, halfway up. Cutter Vane is with him. Everett is hurt. His leg. He has been there since around 10 this morning." Dorothea turned from the door. "Gerald," she called into the house. "Get up. Get the men. Eastern trail horses and the flat sled." Then she turned back to Mabel. "How long has he been there?" "Since around 10. Dorothea's jaw set. "Come inside. I am riding back with you." Dorothea looked at her. "You are half frozen." "I am fine, Mabel." "He came out in this storm for his cattle," she said. "I'm not going to wait at a kitchen table while other people bring him back." Dorothea looked past her at Hellfire, who was standing in the howling dark with his head up and his eyes clear and his breath making great steady clouds in the cold, waiting. "That horse," Dorothea said carefully. "Is that the one they call?" "Yes," Mabel said. "That horse." Dorothea looked at her with the expression of a woman who has been revising her understanding of something and has arrived at the new version with the relief of someone who has been looking for the right answer for a while and finally found it. Then she said, "Get your husband home." And she stepped back to let her people through. There was something else inside that house. Something Mabel did not know yet and would not know until Dorothea told her the following morning after everything was over and the storm had broken and Everett was resting in the main house with his knee bound and his ribs wrapped and the color beginning to come back into his face. Edmund Crane was upstairs. He had arrived in Cold Fork 2 days before the storm, which Mabel understood immediately to mean the timing had not been accidental. He had come with a lawyer from Billings and a territorial court summons. He had presented himself at Briggs' ranch that afternoon while Everett and the hands were already on the ridge, and found only Gus and Lester, who had told him nothing and sent him away. He had then ridden to the Marsh Ranch to ask Dorothea, as the nearest neighboring landowner, to serve as a witness to what he called the irregular circumstances of his sister-in-law's remarriage. Dorothea had given him a room for the night because the storm made turning him out impossible. She had listened to everything he said with the attentive, expressionless courtesy of a woman who has been collecting information for 60 years and knows how not to reveal what she is doing with it. And when Mabel had appeared at her door with snow in her hair, and her husband's life in the balance, Dorothea Marsh had made her choice in the time it takes a sensible woman to look at a situation and see what it actually is. Mabel did not know any of this yet. She was riding back into the storm. Gerald Marsh rode without speaking, which she appreciated. His 4 ranch hands flanked the flat sled behind them. Hellfire did not slow. He moved through the drifts with the intelligence of an animal that has learned terrain under military conditions, reading the ground through the snow with his feet the way a skilled man reads a room, certain and unhurried. She stopped trying to guide him and let him find his own line, and he found one every time. They reached the gully 40 minutes after leaving the Marsh Ranch. Cutter heard them coming and called out from below the overhang. His voice was steady. She dismounted at the gully's edge and went down. Everett was conscious. The relief of it moved through her so completely that she had to stop for a moment and simply hold it before she could do anything else. He was propped against the gully wall under the overhang. His right leg extended at the wrong angle, his color poor but not catastrophic. Cutter was beside him with both their coats piled over Everett's legs, which meant Cutter had been sitting in the Montana cold in his shirt for the better part of 4 hours. She knelt beside Everett and put her hands on his face. His skin was very cold. His eyes found hers immediately. "I told you to stay at the ranch," he said. "I know you did. I meant it. I know you meant it." She was already moving her hands to his leg, working through the fabric of his trousers, feeling for the break, for the angle of the injury, for what was displaced and what was not. His knee. The joint itself, most likely. And the way he was holding his ribs when he breathed told her at least 2 were cracked. She had dealt with worse. She had dealt with much worse in 11 years of nursing a man who refused to take care of himself and expected her to manage the consequences without acknowledgement. "Wiggle your feet," she said. A pause, then, through what she could tell was considerable effort. "Yes." "Good." She sat back. "Gerald's sled is at the top of the gully. We are going to get you on it and get you home." "How did you get here?" he said. She looked up briefly at where Hellfire stood at the gully's edge, dark against the white of the storm. One of Gerald's hands holding his reins loosely because he had learned quickly that loosely was the only option Hellfire accepted. Patient and steady and present. "I asked," she said. And he said yes. Something moved across Everett's face. Too many things at once for her to catalogue them all. "Cutter," she said, "I need your help." Cutter was already moving. They got Everett up at the side of the gully, in stages, careful and slow. Cutter taking the weight on the left side and Mabel on the right, and Gerald's men steadying from above. Everett did not complain. He made one short, controlled sound when his knee took weight it was not ready for, and then he was quiet and stayed quiet all the way up and all the way out. And she thought that this particular quality of endurance, quiet and undramatic and real, was one of the things she had come to understand about him in the 3 weeks since she had arrived. At the top of the gully, Cutter looked at her. Not the way he had looked at her in the first weeks. Not the flat assessing gaze of a man who had already decided. This was direct and without strategy, the look of someone seeing what is actually there. "You came," he said. "Of course," she said. He nodded once. Then he helped settle Everett onto the sled and they began the slow ride back. Edmund Crane was standing in the yard when they came through the gate. He had ridden back from the Marsh Ranch ahead of them, which she had not anticipated. He was standing near the barn door with his Billings lawyer and the summons in his coat pocket and the expression of a man who had prepared something and intends to deliver it regardless of the circumstances he finds when he gets there. He saw the sled. He saw Everett on it. He saw Mabel coming in on the black horse, covered in storm, every inch of her present and purposeful. He said her name. She did not answer. She dismounted and handed Hellfire's reins to Lester, who had appeared from the barn doorway, and she walked to the sled, and she and Cutter got Everett off it together and walked him toward the house. At the porch steps, she stopped. She turned and looked at Edmund. He was standing in the yard of her husband's ranch in the dark and the snow with his lawyer beside him, and whatever he had intended to feel in this moment, whatever confidence he had carried from Columbus to Cold Fork, it was not what he felt now. She could see that from where she stood. He had come to a place where his argument did not fit, and the facts around him were too large and too specific for his language to reach them. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. Not with anger, not with the satisfaction she might have imagined. Just with the direct, clear-eyed presence of a woman who has spent 32 years learning what actually matters and has gotten very good at recognizing what does not. Then she looked away. She helped Everett up the porch steps and through the door. Edmund did not follow. She heard after a moment the sound of him and his lawyer moving away from the porch toward the barn where their horses were stabled. She heard them talking in low voices. She did not listen. She was already in the kitchen, already taking off her coat, already turning to the task that was in front of her, and that was the only thing in front of her right now. She worked on Everett's knee for 2 hours. It was bad, but not permanently bad. The kind of injury that healed with time and the refusal to be reckless again too soon. She told him this in the even clinical tone she reserved for things that were serious and needed to be heard clearly and without softening. He listened without argument. He lay on the kitchen table that Gus had cleared and covered with blankets, and he looked at the ceiling and let her work. He asked no unnecessary questions. He did not perform being fine. He was hurt, and he was cold, and he was exhausted, and he accepted all 3 of those things with the unadorned honesty of a man who has stopped needing to be seen as invulnerable. She found working beside him in the lamplight that she knew what that kind of honesty had cost a man like him to arrive at. She had paid for a similar kind herself. The ribs she bound. She had done it before. By midnight, the storm had begun to ease. The hands who had sheltered in the line shack found their way back through the evening in 1s and 2s, filling the kitchen with the smell of wet wool and the particular relief of men who have been frightened and come through it. Each one that came through the door looked at Everett and then looked at Mabel and did not say anything, which was its own form of acknowledgement. Cutter came in last. He sat at his end of the table and ate the soup Gus had kept warm and was quiet for a long time. The kitchen had settled into the low noise of men warming up boots drying near the stove, voices returning to normal registers. Then Cutter set his spoon down. "I want to say something," he said. The kitchen went quiet in the particular way of people who have been waiting for something without knowing they were waiting. He looked at the table. "I have been on this ranch for 4 years," he said. "I have run the operations, the cattle, the hands, the schedule, and I have done it well." He paused. "And when this woman came here, I decided before she stepped off the stagecoach that she was a problem I needed to remove. And I acted on that decision in ways I am not going to be proud of for a long time." Nobody moved. He looked up, and he looked directly at Mabel, which was something he had avoided for 3 weeks, and which clearly cost him something to do now. "I was wrong about you from the start," he said. "And I am sorry. That is all I have." The kitchen was quiet. Mabel said, "Sit down and finish your soup, Mr. Vane. You have cracked ribs of your own, and Gus's soup is better than anything you will find standing in a doorway making speeches." Something shifted in the room. The particular release of tension that happens when something too tightly held is finally let go. Lester made a sound that was close to a laugh. Wick put his mug down and reached for the bread. Tommy, last through the door, pulled out the bench beside him and sat. Cutter sat. They ate. Gus made the cake the following evening without being asked. He set it on the table after supper, a plain round thing with no decoration, and he stood beside it with his hands clasped in front of him and said very quietly, I have been cooking for working men my whole life. This is the first kitchen I have not wanted to leave." Nobody said anything for a moment. Dorothea Marsh, who had stayed through the storm and through the day that followed, set down her coffee cup and looked at Gus with the direct, appraising gaze she turned on everything. "That she said is the best cornbread I have eaten in 30 years. Gus turned back to the stove, but his shoulders had changed. Edmund Crane presented his summons the morning after the storm. He came to the kitchen in his traveling clothes with his Billings lawyer, and laid the papers on the table in front of Everett with the air of a man who has come a long way and intends to finish what he started regardless of what he found when he got there. Everett looked at the papers. He looked at Edmund. He did not speak. Mabel was sitting across the table with her coffee. She had been expecting this moment since the night before. She had been thinking about it while she set Everett's knee, and while she sat in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to sleep, the lamp burning low, and the storm settling into silence outside the windows. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her. "That property in Dayton sold for $940, she said. Walter's debts amounted to $870. The remainder paid my ticket here and my traveling clothes and left me with $43. There is nothing to claim. There was never anything to claim. You know that." He opened his mouth. She continued, "What you came here for is not money. What you came here for is to make sure I did not get to be happy after Walter. Because if I am happy after Walter, it means Walter was the problem and not me. And you spent 11 years agreeing with him that I was the problem, and you are not ready to let go of that." The kitchen was very quiet. Dorothea Marsh set down her coffee cup. "I witnessed this woman," Dorothea said, "ride a horse. This territory considers unrideable through a blizzard to get help for her husband." She said it with the mild, absolute certainty of someone who is not interested in argument. "I am prepared to say so in any court you would like to name." She looked at Edmund's lawyer. "I have been in this territory for 30 years. Every judge within 100 miles knows my name. I suggest you consider carefully what your client is paying you to do here." The lawyer looked at his papers, then at Edmund, then at his papers again. Edmund Crane stood in the kitchen of Briggs Ranch for a long moment. The summons was in his hand, and the lawyer was beside him, and the room was full of people who had been present for everything, who had watched what Mabel Crane was and what she had done, and who were not going to be told a different version of it. He folded the summons, put it back in his coat pocket. He turned and walked out. His lawyer followed. She heard after a moment the horses in the yard. 2 of them moving away from the ranch at a pace that said the men riding them had decided there was nothing here worth staying for. She listened to the sound of them get smaller, then disappear. She looked at Dorothea. Dorothea raised her coffee mug. Mabel almost smiled. Cutter Vane gave his notice in late January, 2 weeks after the storm. He came to Everett first, which was right, and then he came to find Mabel at the corral. She was inside the enclosure with hell fire, her hand resting on his neck in the posture that had become habitual between them when she heard Cutter's boots on the frozen ground and turned to see him at the rail. He was not wearing any particular expression. She had come to understand that this, the absence of performance, was Cutter at his most open. "I want you to know," he said, "that what you did here." He stopped. "With the horse? With the men?" He started again. "I am a better hand than I was when you arrived." He said it simply. "I did not expect that. I'm glad," she said. He looked at Hellfire. At the easy way the horse stood, weight distributed, head low, the whole body arranged in the posture of an animal that has decided where it is safe. "You are going to be all right, Cutter Vane," she said. "You are too stubborn not to be." He almost smiled. Then he tipped his hat and walked away. And she watched him go and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled since the October morning she had stepped off the stagecoach into a street full of laughter. Spring came to Cold Fork the way it always came to Montana. Not gradually, but suddenly overnight, like a decision made while everyone was sleeping. The snow gave up without ceremony. The mud came. The cattle moved back to the north pasture. The days stretched longer, and the mornings smelled different, and the whole vast country seemed to exhale after holding its breath since November. Edmund Crane did not write again. His attorney in Billings received a response from Everett's attorney that apparently concluded the matter entirely, because after that, the silence on that front was complete. Lester turned 18 in March, and Mabel made him a cake that he ate half of before supper, while pretending he was not doing so, and she pretended not to notice, and this small transaction of mutual pretending felt to her like something real and good. Gus received a letter from his sister in Tennessee and cried quietly over it at the kitchen table, and Mabel brought him coffee and did not ask any questions and sat with him until he was ready to stop. And this too felt real and good. The small intimacies of a life shared with other people. Knowing when to speak and when to simply remain. She rode Hellfire for the first time across open ground on a Thursday in April. Not in the corral, not in the yard. Out through the south gate and across the lower field, and up the rise that gave out onto the wide valley floor with the mountains above carrying their last snow in the highest places where the spring sun had not yet reached. Everett rode beside her on his own horse, his knee healed to the point where he had stopped favoring it, though she still watched him, and he knew she watched him, and neither of them spoke about it because it did not require speech. They rode in silence for a while. The kind of silence that has stopped being the absence of conversation and has become its own form of one. "You are thinking," Everett said. "I always am." "What about?" She looked at the mountains. She felt the horse under her, the solid, certain movement of him, the way he carried her weight, not because he had been broken into it, but because he had chosen it, morning by morning, trust by trust, the same way that any real thing between two creatures is built. "About how wrong they were," she said. "Everyone who said I was too much." He looked at her. "Every single one of them," she said. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "They were measuring the wrong things." She looked at him. "They were looking at the outside," he said, "calling that the whole of it, like a man who judges a winter by the first week of November and thinks he knows what February will bring." She thought about that. He kept his eyes on the mountains. Eleanor used to say that the people worth knowing are always more than what they look like from the road. He paused. She was right about most things. Mabel looked at the mountains too. She thought about Ohio, the kitchen table, the advertisement she had read 3 times because no man had ever used that word before, capable, and meant it as a thing worth having. She thought about the stagecoach and the cold, and the boy who had laughed, and the crowd that had scattered, and the moment she had planted her feet in the mud of Cold Fork's main street and decided for the 10,000th time in her life that she was not going to move. She thought about Hellfire, about 19 mornings, about the specific weight of a hand pressed against a frightened face, and the miracle of that face leaning into it instead of pulling away. She thought about what it meant to be built the way she was built, to take up the space she took up, to have spent 32 years being told she was too much, and to have learned across all of those years that too much was simply the wrong measurement applied to the wrong thing, that what certain people called too much was merely more than they knew how to hold, and that the failure of their hands was not the failure of what they were trying to hold. "This is a real life," she said. Everett looked at her. "The first one I have had," she said. "That was actually mine." He reached across the distance between their horses and took her hand. Both hands. The way you take hold of something you came close to losing and have decided you are not going to be careless with again. She held it back, and they rode like that for a while, across the wide Montana floor with the mountains above them and the spring light falling on everything equally and without judgment. Behind them, back at Briggs Ranch, Hellfire stood at the fence line in the afternoon sun. He was not pacing. He was not braced against anything. He stood with his head up and his ears forward and his whole body arranged in the posture of an animal that has finally, after a very long time, decided that the place it occupies is safe. That the hands that come to it in the morning mean what they have always claimed to mean. That the world, or at least this particular corner of it, can be trusted. He stood still in the April light, and the spring came on around him, and the snow retreated toward the high places where the sun had not yet reached, and the valley filled with the sound of water running where ice had been. And somewhere across the lower field, a woman on a black horse rode toward the horizon with her back straight and her face to the sun, and the whole of her life the real one, the one that was finally hers, opening out ahead of her like country she had always been meant to reach.